The Ex-Worker.
An audio strike against a monotone world.
A twice-monthly podcast of anarchist ideas and action.
For everyone who dreams of a life off the clock.
Welcome back to episode number 2 of The Ex-Worker. Today we'll be offering the first round of our exploration of work and the anarchist critique of capitalism, plus a report back from an anarcha-feminist conference in Ontario, a review of Caliban and the Witch, and plenty more. My name is Alanis.
And my name is Clara, and we'll be your hosts. If you want to learn more about anything we discuss on this episode, don't forget to check out our website at CrimethInc, that's CrimethInc.com/podcast.
And we want to hear from you. Send us an email to podcast@CrimethInc.com, or you can leave us a voicemail by calling 202-59-NO-WORK. That is 202-596-6975.
All right, let's get started with the Hot Wire, our collection of news and updates from struggles around the world. First, we're going to hear from our special Mayday correspondent, Bill Tane, to find out about how radicals around the world celebrated this May the 1st. Bill, what happened?
On Mayday this year, workers and radicals around the world carried on their 127th consecutive year of marches, demonstrations, and rebellions in recognition of International Workers' Day. Here in North America, rallies took place from coast to coast. In Seattle, despite repression and intimidation, police were unable to stop hundreds of marches from creating chaos. An unpermitted nighttime march left 8 officers injured. Chicago anarchists occupied the statue commemorating the Haymarket Affair. 447 were arrested in a Montreal march organized by the Anti-Capitalist Convergence. A black bloc with flaming torches marched through Vancouver, while demonstrators in Washington, D.C. stormed a Gap clothing store, marched on the White House, and confronted white supremacists. Heading south, we saw a mixture of state-sponsored and confrontational celebrations, from the massive parade commemorating Hugo Chavez in Havana, Cuba, to the 150,000-strong march that swarmed the streets of Santiago, Chile, with considerable conflict and dozens of police injured. Radicals fought police in Bogota, Colombia, and Oaxaca City, Mexico, too. Across the Atlantic, demonstrations took place all over Europe, from Malmö, Sweden to Bucharest, Romania, from Andalusia to Vladivostok. In Copenhagen, Denmark, hundreds of anti-fascists and libertarian socialists rallied and booed the mayor off the stage. A general strike in Athens, Greece brought the city to a standstill, with thousands marching against austerity. In St. Petersburg, Russia, protesters rallied against homophobic government policies. The German government drafted 7,000 auxiliary police to try and repress the demonstrations in Berlin. Some of the most intense conflict took place in Istanbul, Turkey, where protesters clashed with the police, who tried to prevent them from taking their traditional march route. Demonstrations also took place in Lebanon, Iraq, Pakistan, Israel, and occupied Palestine. In Africa, anarchists rallied in Tahrir Square in Cairo, Egypt. Workers protested in Nigeria and Tunisia, and radicals in Marrakesh, Morocco demanded freedom for political prisoners. Demonstrations took place across Asia as well, from garment workers in Bangladesh responding to a lethal factory fire to anti-militarists in the Philippines who burned Obama in effigy outside the U.S. Embassy. Workers also gathered in Cambodia, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, India, Japan, and as far south as Australia. If you want to read more, the UK-based Bristol Anarchist Federation has a terrific roundup of global Mayday events. You can check them out at bristolaf.wordpress.com. There's no doubt, the traditions of Mayday resistance are alive and well around the world.
Thanks, Bill. In other news, prisoners around the world are in rebellion, with many engaged in hunger strikes. Over half of the detainees at the U.S. prison colony in Guantanamo Bay are on hunger strike, with some being force-fed against their will. Meanwhile, about 60 asylum seekers in the Netherlands are on hunger strike in Rotterdam, protesting policies that criminalize refugees. And in Greece, nearly 600 inmates in the Larissa Penitentiary have gone on hunger strike protesting their conditions.
In Vienna, Austria, 100 landless students and activists from the initiative Solidarity Agriculture occupied a plot of farmland intended by the city for a construction project.
Police in the UK are in the final stages of testing a new chemical weapon called the DIP, Discriminating Irritant Projectile, a long-range gun firing pellets of CS gas intended for use against protesters.
Scientists declared the African western black rhino, the clouded leopard of Taiwan, and 3 species of butterfly in South Florida extinct.
We're happy to report that V.N., the anarchist who was brutally attacked by Nazis in Kiev recently, has had surgery with the help of solidarity donations from around the world and is recovering from his injuries.
Anarchists in Vancouver claimed credit for an anti-gentrification arson attack that destroyed a home under construction.
Hackers from LulzSec, who targeted police, military, and corporate computer systems for cyber attacks, were sentenced to prison terms in the UK.
Squatters opened 2 new occupied buildings in Turin, Italy.
And finally, we're talking about work in this episode, and speaking of which, if you value your life, stop working. The AFL-CIO just released a report that over 100 people a day die in the U.S. as a result of their work. To put that in perspective, Americans are 271 times more likely to die on the job than they are from a terrorist attack. Given these statistics, the ex-worker officially recommends that the federal government suspend the war on terrorism and initiate a national war on work.
And now it's time for another piece of the CrimethInc Contradictionary. This episode is brought to you, appropriately enough, by Capitalism and Exploitation.
Capitalism. Just as monarchy means rule by monarchs and communism means rule by communists, capitalism means rule by capital itself. The wealthy rotate in and out of power, but the accumulation of wealth remains the determining force. Exploitation. After seizing control of the factory, the workers march to the owner's neighborhood, accompanied by their husbands, wives, friends, and children. They tear down the fences of his hated community and pour through its quaint streets, a riotous torrent clamoring for vengeance. The security guards withdraw in fear as the mob approaches. By the time it reaches his house, the owner is long gone. On the return journey, one former employee sets down his new widescreen television to slap a mosquito on his arm. His son, lugging an armful of groceries, is surprised. "Wow, Dad, that mosquito had a lot of blood in him." "That's not his blood, son," his father responds. "That's my blood."
For more explorations of the war in every word, check out crimethinc.com/contradictionary. You may be wondering why this podcast is called The Ex-Worker. It's not that we don't have jobs. Much of this episode was written by renegade workers stealing time on the clock to scribble notes, send emails, and pore over books and websites while their bosses weren't looking. And it's not that we don't need to work because we all have trust funds to squander on a carefree, revolutionary lifestyle. On the contrary, if you do have a trust fund and you'd like to spend it on the revolution, please report for duty immediately. No, we call this show The Ex-Worker because we don't define ourselves in terms of our roles in the economy. We know our lives could be so much more if we could shed the baggage of wage labor and start using our time and energy and resources for the things that really matter. The ex-worker springs from our desire to undermine the world of work, rather than scrambling to find a better position within it. The CrimethInc Ex-Workers Collective comprises various projects and individuals who are committed to this vision. And that's why we decided to focus this episode on work and the anarchist critique of capitalism. But the topic is so huge. Where do we start? While on the run from police in 1897, the Italian anarchist Enrico Malatesta started writing a book called At the Cafe, Conversations on Anarchism. It presents a basic introduction to anarchist ideas in the format of a bunch of people hanging around in a cafe, talking about their lives and their society. We wanted to find a way to communicate our critiques of work and capitalism that reflects how we actually experience them in our daily lives. So with a nod to Malatesta, we present our ideas about the economy in the form of a discussion between 3 friends hanging out at the coffee shop where one of them is on break from their shift. We write from the perspective closest to our daily reality, as precarious workers in crappy service jobs in the U.S. But the dynamics we talk about stretch throughout the pyramid of the global economy. Perhaps you're listening to this podcast on your commute to your high-powered corporate job. Or maybe you're streaming it on the computer in the public library where you hang out all day because you're homeless. Certainly, capitalism has produced wealth and material comfort for some, while inflicting previously unimaginable poverty on others. But ultimately, we don't think this system is in anyone's best interest. When none of us get to choose our activities based on the values that matter most to us rather than what is profitable or marketable. Not to mention how the destruction of the environment is beginning to threaten life on Earth. No matter where you're positioned in the economy, or where you find yourself next month or next year, we think that you can understand what's going on and find ways to fight against it. We'll return to the cafe in future episodes to talk about other topics that come up. Alternative economies, the difference between anarchism and libertarianism, and the past, present, and future of anti-capitalist resistance. For today, our friends will focus on work, what it is, what it does, who it is and isn't good for, and how to imagine a world beyond it. With that, let's head to the cafe.
All right, I'm going on my break now. Oh, hey, y'all.
Hey.
Hey, you. How's the workday treating you?
You know, it sucks, but what can you do?
Come on. I know you don't want to sling coffee to yuppies for the rest of your life. Any more than I want to waste my nights restocking groceries just to be able to rent a room and eat the occasional burrito.
Of course not. But what else am I going to do? I mean, I could go back to school and get another degree, but then I'd just be in more debt, and there's hardly any jobs now anyways. At least like this, I get to see you on my break.
What did you want to do before you got stuck in the endless loop of service jobs?
I don't know. I guess there's a lot of stuff that I'm interested in and, like, places I'd like to go or whatever, but in this context, it's hard for me to see much further past getting wasted this weekend or vegging out on Netflix. It's kind of sad, I guess, but we should be grateful for what we have, right? I mean, at least we have jobs.
For now.
Right. And as annoying as they are, we're better off than the homeless guys out there, or the ones that pick the coffee beans we're drinking. Ooh, or the shoes I'm wearing.
Sure, but is that our only choice? Being miserable or being broke and miserable? I know we're not the only ones who feel this way. Who doesn't wish they could spend their time the way they wanted to? If you ask me, the problem is work itself.
Wait, are you serious? How can you be against work?
You're a worker. How can you be for it?
I'm not for it, but everybody has to make a living. I don't want to spend my life in this coffee shop, but I have to pay for the rent and feed my cat. I have to work to survive.
So by work, you mean giving up your time, skill, energy, and so on in exchange for a wage?
Yeah, I get it. I'm a wage laborer.
And that's how the coffee shop turns a profit. Your work adds value to the owner's product, and where his profit comes from is the extra amount of value you generate that he doesn't pay you for.
So? I mean, I make lattes. My boss gives me money so I can pay my rent, and he puts the extra money I made for him back into the business so that way I can still have a source of income to pay my rent next month. I mean, that's how I have some security in my life.
I'm not sure how secure that is. Let's say you never get hurt or poisoned or sick here, and that the economy doesn't crash and take your savings with it, and that you don't get mugged by someone who's worse off than you. You still can't be sure you won't be fired. Nowadays, nobody works the same job their whole life. You work somewhere a few years until they let you go for someone younger and cheaper, or they outsource your job overseas. When profit drives everything, you're only as secure as your ability to step on anyone in your way to make a buck. As for the stability of the economy itself, the crisis taught us how secure that is.
What could provide real security? Maybe being part of a long-term community where people look out for each other and determine their own needs and desires, rather than just being cogs in the market economy. And the main thing that holds us back from doing that is work. When we have to work as much as we do these days, Facebook is the closest thing we have to a community.
Okay, say we didn't work. How would we provide for ourselves?
Without bosses, you mean?
Sure, whatever. I mean, what's your alternative?
Think about how many people enjoy gardening, fishing, building, cooking, or computer programming just for their own sake. Would you consider that work?
That's too idealistic. There's no way that kind of activity could provide for all of our needs, even if there weren't bosses and landlords.
But that's how it used to be for most of the time humans have been around. Think about how differently work has worked for most of our history.
Yeah, but we're so much more productive today.
But what do we produce? Enough waste and useless crap to cover the planet in landfills, while there's still a billion people going hungry. What kind of society creates all this abundance while preventing us from actually enjoying it? Our economy is great at producing commodities, to the extent that the earth is actually running out of anything we can use, but terrible at producing happiness.
And anyway, nowadays, in the U.S. at least, many of the jobs don't produce anything useful. They're basically pointless, like yours here in the cafe. In the service sector, we're basically human advertisements that give our employers a marketing edge. I can pour my own coffee. You're just here to create an atmosphere that makes people want to buy it. Most work as we know it isn't necessary at all. Outside of a capitalist economy, it would be worse than useless.
Well, even if our jobs aren't productive in any useful way, at least for some people, working can be fulfilling.
Let me tell a story. My dad worked programming computers all his life. He knew since he was a kid that he loved computers. He went to school for it, and he did it every day for decades. But when I was growing up, he'd come home frustrated from work every day, and over dinner he'd gripe about his lazy coworkers, his idiot bosses, all the ways the management was making his life harder. He was clearly unhappy. But the weird thing was, if you ever asked him outright, he'd always say, "Oh yeah, I love my job."
Why?
I never understood that until I realized that his job turned activity that he loved into work that he hated. If he could have done what he always wanted to do on his own terms, instead of following orders from a company motivated only by profit, he could have found fulfillment maybe. Instead, in order to support our family, he was trapped in this exasperating job that soured him on the thing he used to enjoy most. Work isn't what fulfills us. Often it turns whatever we do into drudgery, by forcing us to evaluate it in terms of profit rather than how fulfilling it is. Plenty of baristas like you love coffee and can take joy in a perfectly poured cappuccino, which then turns to ashes in their mouths when they hand it over to a cranky yuppie who doesn't even bother to look at it.
Or on the flip side, we measure our achievement by the tips we get for our lattes, our grades, or the promotions we earn, instead of how much the things we do enrich our lives and those of the people we care about.
So yeah, I know. I mean, work isn't fulfilling for me either. I know that. And I'll still go to work tomorrow because I have to. But some people go to work because they get something out of it.
What do they get exactly?
I don't know. It creates like initiative or a sense of responsibility.
What kind of initiative? If everything in our society has to be driven by a profit motive or an outside authority to succeed, is that really initiative? What if working actually eats away at our initiative? I remember when I dropped out of school, I started working at a diner, and even though it was a crappy job, sometimes on my days off I'd wake up and think, what am I going to do today? And I'd almost wish I was scheduled to work. The things that actually matter to us get bumped to the bottom of the to-do list, and we learn to only follow through on commitments based on external rewards or punishments, not our passions or values.
As for responsibility, working seems to foster the impression that getting a wage absolves you of responsibility for your actions. Who carried out most of the injustices in history? It was employees, right? You know the Nuremberg defense? I was just following orders. Isn't that what we all tell ourselves? So much of what's wrong with the world today comes from this willingness to check our consciences at the door when we clock in.
For example, the people who picked the coffee beans you're selling, they were paid poverty wages in terrible conditions. Sucks, right? But it's not your fault. You're just the barista. And it's not your boss's fault. He can't control the working conditions in Costa Rica or whatever. And on, all the way up the chain. Everyone's got an excuse. So the gears just keep on grinding in a system where no one can pretend it's just. How is that teaching responsibility?
The real problem isn't employees refusing to take responsibility for their actions. It's the economic system that makes taking responsibility so expensive.
But Okay, fine. Work sucks. But we can't all just stop working and do nothing.
Not working doesn't mean doing nothing. It means doing things because they matter, not because they're profitable. Think what we could accomplish if we were free to use our time and energy how we wanted to, instead of going to work.
The bottom line is simple. We all deserve to make the most of our potential as we see fit, to control our own destinies. Being forced to sell these things away just to survive is miserable and tragic. We don't have to live like this. You can get
Okay, your break's over.
But I just got...
We've got a long line here. Come on, time to get moving.
Sorry, guys. Gotta go. See you later on tonight. Holla.
Bye.
See ya.
Now it's time for the chopping block, where we review something that anarchists are reading and tell you what we think. This episode, we're taking a look at Silvia Federici's book, Caliban and the Witch: Women, the Body, and Primitive Accumulation.
In Caliban and the Witch, Italian feminist Silvia Federici traces the historical developments that laid the groundwork for the emergence of capitalism in Europe. Building upon and critiquing earlier radical histories of the period and the theories of Karl Marx and Michel Foucault, she examines heretic movements, struggles over reproduction, and the witch hunts through a feminist lens. Her analysis focuses on Marx's concept of primitive accumulation, the initial violent theft of resources and labor that served as the foundation of capitalism. She expands this notion to focus not only on the initial appropriation of land, gold, and slaves that made the production of commodities possible, but the ongoing expropriation of women's bodies and labor required for the reproduction of the workforce. In medieval Europe, she argues, this process was catalyzed by the mass extermination of women deemed witches and the destruction of radical peasant and heretic movements that challenged feudal power relations. Capitalism was the counter-revolution of the powerful against the threat posed by these alternate modes of organization. Caliban was published in 2004 by Autonomedia, a New York-based collective focused on radical and especially anarchist theory. It appeared at the tail end of the anti-globalization era, a time of reflection among anarchists and autonomists about the global movement they'd influenced and the future of the neoliberal capitalist system they'd fought. Federici wisely observes that neoliberal institutions such as the free trade agreements and the IMF and World Bank, which sparked mass demonstrations and riots on 4 continents, represent a new wave of primitive accumulation. So understanding how this accumulation happened in medieval Europe as feudalism gave way to capitalism provides directly relevant lessons for our struggles today. This helps explain the book's recent renewed popularity, particularly among anarchists seeking to understand the new primitive accumulation in our own age of austerity, economic recession, and state repression. This popularity also reflects the strategic application of certain Marxist concepts within a larger anarchist framework. Federici engages with them while challenging Marx's linear view of history and limited analysis of gender and reproductive labor. Though Federici is not an anarchist herself, her politics are rooted in the autonomous feminism of 1970s Italy, which continues to influence contemporary anarchism. For example, both urban squatting and property destruction emerged as widespread militant tactics from this time period and trajectory. The book's tone can be a little dry or theoretical at times, but on the whole it's quite engaging, full of rebellious peasants and defiant witches amidst insightful analysis of struggles then and now. It leaves us wanting to know more about the processes of primitive accumulation and witch hunting in the New World, and how to apply her analysis to our North American context. As it stands, Caliban and the Witch offers a crucial analysis of gender and economic history for the well-informed radical. Whether you're interested in feminist challenges to traditional radical theory, fascinating histories of medieval rebellion, or lessons for anti-capitalist struggle today, we highly recommend it.
And now we bring you this episode's Mugshot, the feature in which we profile a group or project that's putting anarchist ideas into action today. A couple weeks ago, correspondents from the Ex-Worker had the opportunity to attend a conference in Waterloo, Ontario, called Engendering Resistance. which focused on themes of gender, militancy, and resistance through a largely anarchist lens. So in this episode, we're going to speak with Tammy, one of the conference organizers, about what happened, the group that pulled it together, and the context of anarchist organizing in that region of Canada. Engendering Resistance was organized by the Waterloo Public Interest Research Group, WPIRG, a group based at the University of Waterloo that provides a place for research, education, and action on environmental and social justice issues. They're funded by student fees, but operate with a fair bit of autonomy. So despite a fairly liberal-sounding mission, many anarchists participate and are able to have the resources to do interesting work.
Basically, we act as a radical hub on campus to provide opportunities for students to take action on things that they're interested in. We have a radical lending library. We have groups that work on issues like prison, abolition, Indigenous solidarity work around gender and addressing sexual violence in our communities, anti-poverty organizing, and the like.
Waterloo is a university town of just under 100,000 people in southern Ontario, northwest of the U.S. border at Buffalo. The nearby cities of Guelph, Hamilton, and Toronto have active radical communities, many of whom participated in the conference. Tammy discussed the context for anarchist organizing in the region over the past few years, framed by the mass mobilization 3 years ago against the G20 summit.
2010 G20 happened in Toronto. Anarchist networks in the region were very heavily infiltrated and targeted. There were large conspiracy cases, a lot of repression, people facing charges. So you had a whole bunch of organizers facing legal battles, those not facing legal battles, putting a lot of time into supporting those that were, and that really affected the level of organizing. That's all wrapped up, and things I think are bouncing back. There's a lot of organizing that started off recently around the Line 9 reversal in Ontario. So tar sands oil will be going through Ontario soon through a pipeline that's already there, and anarchists have been getting really involved with that. And then there's a lot of anarchist involvement in the region, a lot around prison support, and then just sort of the general anarchist gatherings, book fairs, info shops, stuff like that.
One of the main projects WPIRG undertakes is organizing an annual conference for radicals in the region. Each year, the organizing collective chooses a different theme. Past conferences had focused on topics like prison abolition or food justice. Tammy explained why they decided to focus this year on gender and militancy.
On the one hand, organizers in the collective felt really frustrated with the sort of direction the work and discourse a lot of sort of the more mainstream feminist groups in the area use, or sort of their analysis, and wanted to intervene and provide a space to facilitate discussions that put forth the idea that a meaningful engagement with questions related to gender liberation must also include things, for instance, like a critique of the state and a critique of capitalism and white supremacy, and sort of broadening the discussions of gender as we saw them playing out. For instance, a lot of groups in our area might do great work addressing certain gender issues, but work a lot with the regional police and don't have any type of analysis of being critical of state forces. The flip side for that, as people that work in a lot of other spaces, whether it's anarchist spaces or more broad anti-capitalist spaces, being frustrated seeing discussions of gender sort of put to the side. Folks have a great analysis of state repression or a great analysis of capitalism, but leaving out or undervaluing the discussion of working in gender to the work that we're doing.
Although WPIRG itself isn't explicitly anarchist, the organizers felt it was crucial to ground the content, organizing process, and structure of the conference in anarchist values.
In terms of content for the conference, there was an open call out for proposals, but we definitely prioritize proposals that engage with questions of gender from a more radical perspective and put forward solutions that were community-based and not relying on state institutions or parliamentary solutions to issues of gender, and also trying to open up discussions in gender and wanting to work in discussions of how it relates to anarchism itself. In terms of the organizing process, it was organized by a non-hierarchical collective. Everyone took on responsibility and were actively involved in deciding the theme, what the weekend would look like, taking on different roles. And then in terms of the structure of the weekend itself, an ongoing emphasis was placed on trying to make it as accessible as possible for folks. So taking things into consideration, like having it in a physically accessible venue, providing ASL, childcare, having it free, having the conference be free, food provided for the entire weekend, and even trying to pay for facilitators to be able to come in so that no economic issue would be a barrier to participating in the conference.
Engendering Resistance took place April 19th through 21st on the campus of the University of Waterloo. Over the course of the weekend, some 200 to 300 people attended, largely folks actively engaged in resistance movements in the region, as well as others from the U.S. and other regions of Canada. There were 2 full days of workshops on a fascinating range of topics.
Community accountability and critical discussions around addressing sexual violence, the gendering of militancy and different forms of resistance, queering anarchism, beyond politics of self-care, history of feminist thought and practice, feminism in independent media, femme identity in anarchist communities, creating anti-racist feminist spaces.
A powerful keynote talk by Jackie Wang discussed revolutionary loneliness, laying out a theory of alienation through the lens of the experiences of women and gender-variant people who took part in 20th century revolutionary struggles.
We also hosted a few performances, film screenings, and the Saturday evening of the conference organized and hosted a noise demo at GVI, which is the Grand Valley Institute for Women, which is a federal prison located in the city. So it was one small attempt to try to ground what we're doing for the weekend conference, not only in discussions, but having a small action component in there.
Looking back on the weekend, Tammy appreciated the relationships built through these conversations while recognizing the limitations of the conference framework.
You can have good discussions and bring people together in that way, but in terms of tying it to concrete action or figuring out ways to continue on the conversation after everyone has dispersed and gone back to their different cities is always a challenge and really difficult to measure.
In the end, what matters is how these events expand our capacity to resist. And Engendering Resistance provided new ideas and connections to further our struggles against gender oppression and all forms of hierarchy. If you want to learn more about Engendering Resistance or WPIRG, you can find links at our website at CrimethInc.com/podcast.
And last but not least, it's time for next week's news, our calendar of events and happenings of interest to anarchists.
First, we want to speak with Will from the Global Justice Ecology Project, who's going to tell us about some resistance coming up at the end of the month in Asheville, North Carolina. Will, what's going on in Asheville at the end of this month?
So from May 26th to June 1st, the genetically engineered trees industry is going to be meeting in Asheville for their biannual International Tree Biotechnology Conference. Basically, it's going to be all the big players in the genetically engineered trees business gathering to discuss their nefarious plans to spread GE trees across the world.
And why should we be concerned about the genetically engineered tree business?
So we've seen what's happened with GMO companies like Monsanto and DuPont, who are in the process of taking complete control of the world's food supply and the devastating impacts of that. Right now, the GE trees industry is in the process of doing exactly that to our forests. Right now, they're trying to develop or plant GE eucalyptus across the southeastern U.S., and eucalyptus is incredibly invasive and flammable, and it's known as flammable kudzu because of how quickly they can spread and the deadly wildfires they have caused in California and Australia. And then other applications of GE pine and poplar will have irreversible, devastating impacts on biodiversity, completely wrecking forests across the continent and across the world.
So what can we do to resist?
First and foremost, you can come to Asheville from May 26th to June 1st. There's going to be a huge march and protest on Tuesday, May 28th. We're also going to be at the March Against Monsanto on Saturday, May 25th, and there will be ongoing actions and events throughout the week in Asheville. You can go to treebiotech2013.org for more info on the protest or to donate. And for more info on the campaign to stop GE trees, you can check out nogetrees.org or globaljusticeecology.org.
Great. Thank you very much, Will.
Yeah, thank you.
As we mentioned last time, today the Mountain Justice Summer Action Training Camp kicks off outside Damascus, Virginia, with a week of activities against mountaintop removal coal mining.
In Montreal, Quebec, they're having an entire month of events this May called the Festival of Anarchy. Art exhibits, demonstrations, workshops, bike tours, and lots more. One of the particularly exciting happenings is the International Anarchist Theater Festival, the only one that happens anywhere in the world as far as we know. It's their 8th year of doing it, and this time they've got 25 different artists performing over 2 nights of provocative, socially engaged theater in French and English.
On the weekend of the 24th to the 26th, there are several anarchist book fairs happening in Montreal as part of the Festival of Anarchy, as well as in Lisbon, Portugal, and also the Balkan Anarchist Book Fair in Ljubljana, Slovenia.
Also on the 25th, groups are planning an international day of protests against Monsanto, the St. Louis-based biotech giant infamous for pushing genetically modified crops across the world. Demos are expected in at least 36 countries and 48 states in the U.S. Find one near you at occupy-monsanto.com.
We've also got several political prisoners whose birthdays are coming up. On the 21st, we have Mondo Elanga, a poet, activist, and former Black Panther incarcerated in Nebraska.
On the 26th, Cece McDonald, a transgender woman locked up for defending herself against a racist and transphobic assault.
On the 27th, Norberto González Claudio, a socialist Puerto Rican independence fighter.
And on the 31st, Doug Wright, one of the Cleveland Four, who was framed by the FBI in a fake bomb plot.
If you want to send any of these folks some mail to let them know they're not forgotten, we've got their addresses and links to info on their cases posted at CrimethInc.com/podcast.
And finally, May the 30th is the 199th birthday of Mikhail Bakunin, one of our all-time favorite anarchist maniacs. Light a candle for him.
That does it for this episode of The Ex-Worker. Thanks to everyone for listening. I'm Alanis.
And I'm Clara. And we'll be back with our third episode on June 2nd, when we'll be exploring green anarchism.
This has been a production of the CrimethInc Ex-Workers Collective, a spark looking for a powder keg in the dark. We want to thank Will and Tammy for coming on the show to speak with us.
And thanks again to Underground Reverie, who provided us with the music you've heard in this episode.
Don't forget to check us out at CrimethInc.com/podcast. If you've got any comments or feedback or ideas for future episodes, drop us a line at podcast@CrimethInc.com, or you can leave us a voicemail at 202-59-NO-WORK. That is 202-596-6975.
Till next time, out of the cafes, into the streets.
Take care.